So here we have the classic Amiga 500, which is also one of Commodore's most classic machines and also one of my absolute favorites. Now, what a lot of people like to do, just like me, is to replace the floppy drive, the internal one. And that can be done with a small device called the HxC Floppy emulator, which is this. Now this is the SD card version, and what that means, you can plug in an SD card and you can download all the ADF files from online and use them on the real Amiga hardware. So the board just comes like that, just bare, and what I've done, because I didn't want to have the board lying bare on the table like that, I've just 3D printed this small plate. And if you really want to go into detail, the instructions can be found online. So what we're going to do now is, well, we will hook up the HxC Floppy emulator to the Amiga, and that means we have to replace the internal drive. And well, hooking up the HxC Floppy emulator is the easiest part of everything. So let's put it aside and start. So I already have removed all the 6 screws the Amiga case has got, and the cover should just come off like that. Let's lay that aside. Now if we take a look in here, we see there is the keyboard, and we of course have to remove this. There is this bunch of cables coming from the motherboard going into the keyboard. So what we've basically got to do is we have to grab that cable and just pull it out. Now this is very important. You have to remember the polarity of that plug. The black goes to the left, or otherwise you could damage that chip or just something else in the Amiga.
Okay, now there are 4 more screws here, here, here and here, and if you undo all these screws, there's this piece of metal which is a shielding for where you would connect the Amiga 500 expansions, as for example a hard disk drive or the ACA 500. So make sure you keep that and lay it aside with all your screws. Now if we are already here and have disassembled the Amiga like that, make sure that the battery on the RAM expansion is okay. If you have an Amiga 500 Plus, it may be that there is also another battery below the shielding, which you definitely have to take great care of. Because the Amiga 500 has got a real-time clock on board, and the real-time clocks, as you can see here, are battery powered, and some Amiga 500 Pluses have it even worse and have got 2 batteries. That depends on what kind of expansion memory you put in them. Some will even have an additional real-time clock, which is a bit unnecessary. Now there are some tabs on the shielding, here, 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 and over here. So you just gotta lift those up. I've got long fingernails, so that's the easiest way to do it. And then you just pull it straight up if it wants to come off. Sometimes the shielding gets stuck. There we go. Now we can remove the floppy drive. Just pull the cable out. Another thing that might be helpful is to remember the polarity. Some cables have got the this red line here on the side, or the tab on the bottom, or got one of the holes covered. For example, on this floppy drive the cable only fits in one way. Here would be where the covered hole will go, and this is where the tab would go. There's a cutout in the PCB for that. And also you can disconnect your power. There you don't have to worry, because that thing only fits in one way. Now to hook up the HxC Floppy emulator, you need a longer floppy cable. You can use the cable just like you want to. Preferably you want a cable that has got all the holes opened, because the Amiga mostly only has all the pins, and you do not want to cut off the pins or modify the cable, which would be quite annoying. Now as you can see, I already have modified the power cable and made it a lot longer, because the HxC Floppy emulator, well, I'm using it externally, so I of course need a longer cable. Some people tend to feed it out of the back, I tend to feed it out of the floppy drive port. And well, for the power supply, the manufacturer recommends you remove the 12 volt line. So you have to take a multimeter and check the pins. You can see in my case it's on the far left. Now we also have to disconnect the floppy cable. This is a little bit more difficult. Well, of course you have to remove the 12 volt line, just cut it in half and cover up the contacts of the cable so you do not short anything out. Now this is very important. You have to remember the polarity. Well, of course the great thing about the Amiga, it has got everything marked, so your cable should just go in. Okay, so well, if you have got the cable, the floppy cable in there, and the floppy power cable in there, which you have modified to make it longer and remove the 12 volt line, it's time for the next step, and that is just to reassemble your Amiga. Let's just put this aside, and you can just feed the wires outside. That's how I do it. A lot of people tend to make modifications to the case so they can feed it out of the back, or just hardwire the HxC floppy emulator inside and cut a hole for the screen into the top of the Amiga, but I don't want to damage the case. So let's go and put everything back together. Here it is again very important that you remember the polarity of the plug, otherwise you could damage something. I know I already said that, but yeah. Okay, and all that's left now is you take your HxC floppy emulator, plug in the power, just a regular floppy connector, as you can see. And the last thing to do is just plug the floppy cable in. It only fits in one way. There's nothing you can do wrong. And again here, you preferably want a cable that has got all pins and not one hole covered, because the HxC floppy emulator as well as the Amiga have all pins. You do not want to modify the cable. That's quite annoying. Okay, now you can just place your floppy emulator wherever you want. Oops. Let me screw that thing into there. I haven't done that. And yeah, that's everything you need to do to connect the hardware to your Amiga. Now the next step is how you prepare your SD card for it, and how you will finally be able to load all your ADF files. So now, since we're done configuring all the hardware, it's time to plug in your SD card to your computer. Wait, that's wrong. You need a Windows or Mac computer with an SD card reader. Now, before we start moving anything to the SD card, we need to download this software. It's called HxC Floppy Emulator. And what the software does, well, it prepares your SD card because of a specific file we need to create, otherwise the HxC Floppy Emulator won't operate correctly. And well, also we have to use the third program called Batch Converter, which will allow us to copy multiple floppy files onto the SD card in a specific format called HFE, which is the format the HxC Floppy Emulator can read and will also use all your virtual images for. So, first of all, we have to go under Settings, up there, and
click on that, and we have to select the SD HxC Floppy Emulator because that's the model I'm currently using. Now here we have the settings for it, and we have to create the config file. Now one thing I have to point out is you may want to make sure that two things don't have a check. First of all, you remove the check from last loaded floppy. Well, that means it will always load the last loaded floppy. If you switch your Amiga off, it will continue where you left off on that disk, but it won't save anything. And also you might want to make sure that the auto boot mode is disabled because, well, that's an option how you can use your HxC Floppy emulator without the screen. So I'm just going to save that on in a folder which I have made on my desktop called HxC Floppy. There it is. And now just hit save. That's it. Okay. Now let's just go ahead and copy some ADF files. Here on my desktop I have got a folder called Amiga ADF. Let's click on that, and we have a ADF file in it, and that's a flying game from Electronic Arts called FA18. So that's the program that I'll try to copy. So first of all we have to click on Batch Converter, which converts multiple floppy images. And we have to select our source directory. Now that is the Amiga ADF folder. You always have to copy entire folders. You can't just copy single files, because otherwise the program will crash. So select that, and now we have to select our target folder, which is the HxC Floppy folder that I have created, which is also on my desktop. So let's just select our target, and that is this folder, HxC Floppy. Hit OK, and now we only have to hit convert. So the file is now converted. Now we can start copying everything to the SD card. It will open the folder automatically. Just select the files and move them to the SD card. So this is what your SD card should look like. You have your ADF file, which is converted, and your config file. What we can do now is just eject your SD card, and now you can plug it into your HxC Floppy emulator. That's it.
So now we can remove our SD card from the computer and plug it into the floppy emulator. It's time to switch everything on. Second for the CRT to warm up, and there we go. Now the HxC Floppy emulator will show the trashes folder and so on. These are hidden folders on there. Oh, it's really hard to get a good focus on that. So these are just all hidden files, they will always appear, and here's our converted file. As you can see, it will say on the end .adf.hfe. There we go. And now you just hit the middle button, which is OK, and it will load. For some reason the game is in Spanish. Doesn't matter, I understand it anyways. So yeah. Just turning up the volume. So let's skip the crack throw. And wait for the game to load. There we go. Still loading. just enable the demo. It's a pretty cool game with nice 3D graphics. Well, for a computer this old, it's pretty awesome. Okay, I just have reset the Amiga. So that is how you take digital files of Amiga disks that you can easily download online and make them work on an emulator and use them on real Amiga hardware without emulators, which is quite nice. Now the cool thing about this is you can also salvage disks that you already have by using an external drive and just creating empty HFE files and put that one here. Or you can also, if you want to, do the same process in the other direction and take files you have on here and put them through the external drive onto real disks, which is also quite cool, but I prefer the digital format. So yeah. That is how to set up your Amiga 500 for an HxC floppy emulator. For all Amigas that have the motherboard and the keyboard built in like this one, it's the exact same process, the 600 and 1200 and 500 plus, exact same way. And the Amiga 1000 and 2000 and the 4000, it's a bit more difficult. And this is where I would also recommend you use a different SD HxC floppy emulator, which has a similar interface like the floppy drive and also looks a lot like it and just fits in there. But yeah, that's basically it.